Good evening, everyone. I just want to take a moment and thank everyone for coming this evening. My name is Joshua Scram. I'm a senior long-range planner with the city and lead on the city's zoning bylaw project. I really appreciate the attendance, both in person and virtually. This is a big milestone for the city. Addressing a bylaw that's over 30 years old. So on behalf of the project team and myself, I thank you. I just want to outline this evening's presentation format. So what we'll do is we'll start with the presentation on the bylaw. That'll be led by our planning consultant, Paul Lowe's from SGL. And then we'll get into a question and answer period. So we do have participants online. So this is a hybrid format. So with the assistance of our other planning consultant, Donna Hyde, over there from the planning partnership, we will work in combination. So we'll have some questions virtually, and then we'll take some questions on the floor. And then towards the end of the meeting, what we'll do is we'll conclude the formal presentation, and then we'll have an open house for those in attendance. So if you have questions specific to your property or a certain property, we do have a number of resources at the back where we can walk through those in detail. We have a number of staff here from both planning and development, so planners and development staff and transportation and engineering, and we'd be happy to take those questions at that time. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Paul Lowe's for the presentation.
Thanks, Josh. If we can get the presentation up, great. So if you were with us before, we've had, I think this is going to be our third little event we've had in the council chambers here, walking you through the zoning bylaw as we progress from the background studies through to strategic directions, and now we're at the zoning bylaw. So a lot of what I went over the last time with the strategic directions you'll see now in the bylaw, but now we have the detailed zoning bylaw now and the maps, and city staff have done a lot of effort on taking what we came up with in the various zones and applying it to all the properties in Brantford and creating the map. So I'll quickly go through the presentation with you. And I'm not going to walk you through the whole zoning bylaw because my gosh, we'll be here all night and everybody be sound asleep. So I'm going to try and hit on some key points. And to start, for those people in the room or online who heard of a zoning bylaw, don't know what is a zoning bylaw. Well, it really it takes an official plan, which is very general, broad brush, applies the vision for the city, and takes and applies it to the specifics on a property. So what can you do on the property? What uses are allowed? What size of property, size of building can you put on the property? What are the yards? What are the setbacks you have to have from your front yard, from your side yard, from your rear yard? What are the parking standards? How many cars can you park on your property? What's the minimum amount you have to provide parking for? What are the landscaping requirements? So it's getting the detail on the property, and that's what a zoning bylaw is. And what a zoning bylaw is not, it's not a design tool. So it doesn't provide to tell you how to design your home. It doesn't tell you how to design interior buildings. It doesn't design our streetscapes. Those are all other standards that we have: site plan, streetscape standards, road standards. And it also doesn't get into construction. That's all in the building code. So it's just setting the parameters of what is permitted on a property and where you can locate buildings on a property. So that's what a zoning bylaw is. So, and how does the zoning bylaw, you might say, how does it work with official plan? How does it work with provincial policy? Well, really, it's at the end. It's at the bottom. So we start off with provincial policy. We have the Planning Act. We have the provincial policy statement, the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And that all tells the official plan what to do. So the city's got a new official plan. It was a couple of years old now. It guides how the city will be developed. And now the zoning bylaw is intended to implement that official plan on a property basis. So these are the chapters in the new zoning bylaw, and the new zoning bylaw applies across the city. Currently in the city, there's two zoning bylaws. There's old Brantford zoning bylaw, and there's the County of Brant zoning bylaw that applies to those parts of Brant County that are brought into the city back a few years ago. So that's taking those two bylaws, creating a new zoning bylaw that implements the official plan. And excuse me. And if you're at any of our previous meetings, the approach we've taken is a bit different, because right now, if you looked at official plan, you looked at the zoning bylaw, you go, how does that zone, that R7 zone match this official plan? What we've now tried to do is make the zoning categories very close to what the official plan categories are. In some cases, we need a few more zoning categories for the official plan, but we've tried to reflect those very closely. You'll definitely see that in the mixed use zones. Mixed use zones almost identically match the official plan designation. So we've tried to make that a little simpler for the public to follow. So these are the 14 different sections. I'm not going to hit on every one of them. I'm going to hit on some of the bigger ones. And I'm not going to hit on some of the more general provisions that apply across the municipality. So you have an administration section that touch how to administer the bylaw. We have general provisions that are provisions that apply across the municipality, whether you're in a residential or mixed use zone. We have definition section, and we have parking and loading regulations. Those are all very specific. I'm not going to touch on those tonight. Happy to talk about those if you have any questions on them. But I'm going to start off with what's new to this bylaw is a user guide section. It's really designed to help the public and help you folks and others try and understand how to read the zoning bylaw. If you want to know what you can do on your property, well, this is designed to help you out. And I'm going to try, I've got a couple of examples and question examples I'm going to walk you through using this how-to guide. But first, what is the user guide section? Well, it really is, it's a section right up front that helps understand how to read the bylaw. It takes a step-by-step approach to go through the bylaw to understand it, how to find applicable provisions that apply, how to find what's permitted on the property. It starts with an introduction, purpose of the zoning bylaw, so just explaining to people what a zoning bylaw is, and then gets into the steps of the user guide. There's lots of graphics that go along with it to help understand it. I'm going to get into a little more detail when I go into a couple of questions. So I want to start with a couple of the bigger zones that cover more of the municipality than others, and that's starting off with the mixed use zones. And we have 6 mixed use zones, and these reflect exactly the designations in the official plan. So we have the historic Main Street, the lower downtown, the upper downtown. Those 3 apply in the downtown area. Then we have the major commercial center zone, which is a mixed use zone, but it's where you see the larger, the malls in this zone, and a couple other the major commercial areas. We have the Brant Heritage Conservation District along Brant Street, and we have intensification corridors that are along the major arterial roads, and those were all defined in the official plan. And for each one of these, it sets out the permitted uses, and it sets out the typical lot and yard provisions. So here's an example, and these are just excerpts you'll see in the bylaw. So this is table 20, and it sets out the permitted uses for the mixed use zones. You'll see at the top of the table, we have the 6 zones, and along the left-hand side, the left-hand column, we have the permitted uses. Now that's not just all the permitted uses, it's just an excerpt. It's a fairly long table. And then if you look at each row, it sets out the use. And then if it's P, means it's permitted in that zone. If there's just a dash, it means it's not permitted. And then there's ones that have a Q, a Q1. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means it's permitted subject to that qualification. So it may say you're permitted, but it's limited to this. And you'll see that at the bottom of every table. We'll set up what the qualifications are. I'll take you through some examples in a bit. And just to give a quick overview, this is similar as the last presentation when we talked about strategic directions. The various, in terms of the heights, this sets out the maximum heights and the minimum heights, but each one's also subject to angular zone provision. So if it's near a low density residential area, it has to have subject to an angular plane, which I'll give you an example about in a minute. So it might not be that maximum height, but that is generally the maximum heights permitted. So in the historic Main Street zone, it's a minimum height of 3 and a maximum height of 8. The lower downtown, it's where the highest heights are permitted in the city, and that's a maximum of 24 stories. Upper downtown is minimum height of 2 and a maximum height of 8. And then to the other mixed use zones, we have the major commercial zone, which is the major where we see the mall and other major commercial properties, maximum height of 18 stories. The Brant Avenue Heritage Conservation District zone, that Heritage Conservation District plan sets out a maximum height of 3 stories, so that's reflected in the zoning bylaw. Then the rest of the intensification corridors are generally 12 stories, except along Erie Avenue, the official plan caps it at 6 stories. So that's the one difference. You'll also see, and I'll touch on base on one of the questions that comes up. You'll see for some of the commercial intensification corridors, they're reflecting of old main streets. And so we have a PP after that zone, and where a PP applies that property, it means if property is going to be redeveloped, they have to maintain the retail on the main floor. So we want not residential redevelopment on the main floor, but it could be multiple stories with residential above, but it has to maintain that commercial retail on the main floor. And some additional zone provisions where the city has an urban design guidelines, which sets out some urban design standards when you're bringing in these large new multi-story buildings. But there's other provisions we can put in the zoning bylaw, so we can limit the length of a building. So if it's a 6 or 8 story building and it's along a street, you know, if it's quite long, it's quite a building, quite a mass on the street. So we're trying to minimize that by a maximum length of 60 meters. This is where I talked about the 45-degree angular plane that you'd apply adjacent to residential. So stepping that back, and I'll show you a plan of that in a second. We also, when you have buildings above 8 stories, so 8 stories just is generally a mid-rise building. When you get above that, what we want to do is we want the towers above that to shrink down to it so that they're not so big, be separated by a good separation distance, and step back from the base floors. And I'll show you an example of that. So those that are 8 stories above should be separated by 25 meters to give that privacy and reduce shadowing. The floor plate of the overall tower, we're limiting to 750 square meters, again, to reduce any shadowing. And then we also we're going to require a minimum balcony depth because if you have any smaller than basically 5 feet and 1.2 meters, about 5 feet, it really becomes unusable balcony. So you need that minimum. So some of these are some of the standards. This is just an example of some of the standards we've set out in the zoning bylaw for these main mixed-use areas. So this is just an example of a mid-rise building on the left, and then a tower building on the right, and then the podium, when we say it's step back from the podium, that's an example in the podium. And then that tower portion needs to be minimized in size. I think these towers are bigger than 750 square meters. So there's supposed to be a smaller size tower to try and limit that shadowing and try and limit the mass when you're getting a taller building. And this is an example when I talked about a 45-degree angular plane. You have low-rise residential. It's basically a 45-degree angular plane from the property line. So it steps the building back away and steps it gradually up if it's close to the residential. And you see at the bottom, that's the podium, and then the setback to the tower portion. So those are one of the aspects we're looking at in the zoning bylaws. All these provisions aren't in your current zoning bylaws. Some new provisions we're going to add to address these higher buildings, as we're going to anticipate getting more of these higher mixed-use apartment buildings. So here's one example I wanted to go through. This is a hypothetical question that we came up with, but I think it helps walk through how to use the zoning bylaw for the mixed use. So the question would be, I own a building on an intensification corridor. I want to redevelop the property. Maybe it's a 1 or 2 story building right now, or it's an old gas station. And I want to redevelop the property for a 6-story mixed use building. How do I figure out what parts of the bylaw apply? So what you do is you start off with the map that shows it's the key map that shows the various maps that pull into it. We have maps at the back that show the whole zoning bylaw in the area, but for the purpose of the zoning bylaw, we broke it down into smaller maps so you can really read them. So you go to the key map, figure out what area applies, and then you go to that map on the right, and I'll zoom in a little more detail. You find your property, which is with the blue arrows, shows it's an intensification corridor. So then you go to the intensification corridor section in the bylaw. You look at the permitted uses, and so this is table 20, and it sets out the residential permitted uses with the intensification corridor on the far right column. Sets out all your permitted uses. And then you have table 21 is the non-residential permitted uses. Again, these are excerpts. There's more permitted uses than that. And you see on the table 21 on the right, there is a Q1 right at the top for bed and breakfast establishment. So what does the Q1 mean? It's permitted as a secondary use. So you're permitted to have that, but the qualification is it has to be a secondary use. So that's how those qualifications work. Permitted, yes. provided something occurs. In this case, it provides a secondary use. And then you go to the next table. You look for the intensification corridor, and these are the zone provisions. So the maximum lot frontage, the maximum lot area, the coverage, building height, all set out in that table, so you can figure out what all zone provisions apply. And at the bottom, there'll be numbers. So for instance, on building height, you'll see the number and a little footnote. On the bottom of that table, there's some footnotes. So on that one, it says except along Erie Avenue where the maximum building height shall be 6 stories. So that's an example where you look and you find what applies to that property and what am I permitted to do. In addition, there's some additional provisions, and those are provisions I walked you through before. The 45-degree angular plane are some of those additional provisions. The NIST, the pedestrian prominent provision for intensification corridor is additional provision. There's some retail and office caps. So there's a number of additional provisions that aren't set out in the table, and those are found right after the table. And as I started off, I said in this presentation, I said there's a couple sections, additional sections that aren't zone specific but apply across the municipality. So even when you get through that, you get through the intensification corridor provisions, don't forget about general provisions that might apply. For this one, site triangle, if you're on a corner of the intensification corridor. Your definitions, any words that are bolded are defined. So if you see a bolded one when you're looking through, we need to look at the definitions for that. And then there's also parking and loading standards that you'd want to look at if you're on intensification corridor. And at the bottom, it shows what the parking standard is for a mixed-use building. So that shows you how to walk through if you're in an intensification corridor. I'm going to do another one for residential in a second after I go through the residential provisions. So the residential zones probably cover the majority of the municipality. We have 6 residential zones. We have the suburban residential zone, and I'll cover that off. Existing neighborhood low rise, which is probably the bigger of the residential zones applying to all the existing residential neighborhoods. The Greenfield neighborhood low rise, which applies to the new areas in the expansion area. And then we have some more mixed, we have the neighborhood corridor, which is a higher density with some commercial uses, mid-rise and high-rise. So let's just walk through a couple of those. First, we have a similar table that we had for mixed use, setting out the permitted uses. And again, the 6 residential zones are along the top. Permitted uses are along the left-hand side, and we have the Ps or Qs depending on what the use is in the zone. And just to go over what the different zones, residential zones are, most of these would be just found in the official plan as residential, but there's some different characteristics of these residential areas. So the suburban residential areas is the unserviced lot. So these are in Tuttle Heights and a few other locations where currently they're unserviced. So these require, because they're unserviced and they're not municipal servicing, they require bigger lots because they have individual septic. So it sets out a larger minimum lot area and a larger frontage requirement for those lots. Then the existing neighborhood low rise is generally all areas of the municipality, which are the singles and semi-attached areas you find currently in the municipality, with continuing the existing height, a maximum height of 10 stories. And then we have the newer greenfield areas, which provide a little bit broader range of housing. You have townhouses in those areas, block townhouses, permits a little higher height for townhouses, as well as the singles and semis. In the neighborhood corridor zone, we find that in the new expansion areas. This is more on the collector roads, where we provide for a little higher density. This is all set out in the official plan, as well as some local serving commercial uses, convenience stores, restaurants, personal services, and you can have apartments up to 6 stories on those corridors. So this is in the expansion areas, largely to the north and around a little around the Tuttle Heights area. And then we have a mid-rise zone, which permits up to 6 stories for apartments and 4 stories for townhouse areas, and then residential, the high-rise residential zone, which permits to 12 stories. So another question example of how to walk through the bylaw. This is for residential. So I own a house in LR, so a neighborhood low-rise zone, and I would like to redevelop my property, build a new house. How do I figure out what parts of the bylaw apply? So again, you look to the key map, figure out where you sit in the key map, you find your local map. I'll zoom in on that map. There's your property, and it's an LR F18, A55, C35. And you say, oh my gosh, that's daunting. How do I figure out those numbers? Well, it's very simple. The F stands for frontage. So my minimum lot frontage is 18 meters. A stands for the minimum lot area, so it's 550. And C stands for lot coverage would be 35%. And say, why did we do that? Well, right now you have a number of zones, R1, R2, R3, R4, on and on. What we've done is gone with one zone, but in different areas of the city, based on the existing characteristics, we'll have different frontage, different lot areas, different lot coverages. So it's all the same zone, but in different areas, you're going to have those different characteristics, and we're trying to reflect those characteristics. And, you know, we'd love to hear from you. The city has done a lot of work on mapping these different areas. If you think those should be different, that's what we want to hear from you. That's the purpose of tonight's meeting, to get that feedback. So you find that out, and then again, you go to the permitted uses. We have a separate table for the permitted uses, of course, and you find out what's permitted in an LR zone. You go to the zone provision table. So although the lot frontage, lot area, and lot coverage is set out on the map, there's additional provisions. So your yard setbacks, your maximum height, your landscaped open space, all set out in this additional table, as well as some additional requirements at the bottom. And then again, there's a couple of additional provisions that aren't set out in the table. So in the neighborhood low rise, there's a maximum depth of a building, so 20 meters, to try and keep from buildings getting, people building large monster homes in a neighborhood that go a lot deeper on the property. So we want to be able to control that. If we want to go deeper, that's a minor variance to go through the committee of adjustment. We also, to try and keep the height of a building down. So it's 10 meters, that's 10 meters. Somebody could do a flat roof building at 10 meters. So it gets quite a large height, or you have very a low peaked roof. So what this other provision is doing is requiring a maximum height between the finished grade and the eaves. So try and bring the eaves down to reduce the height, the appearance of height on the building. Those are just a couple of design standards that we've used. So those are just a couple of the general provisions. And the additional provisions. And of course, just like mixed use, you just don't forget to look at general provisions, definitions, parking requirements are all different based on the use you're looking at. So a couple of the other zones I'll just quickly go through, not as much depth, but we have institutional zones. We have 2 institutional zones. This is very similar to what we had in the strategic directions report. We have the major institutional and the minor institutional zone. The difference being major institutional, those are designated in the official plan. So the hospital, high schools, those bigger properties are major institutional. Minor institutional, elementary schools, places of worship, you find those in your neighborhood, and they're currently designated residential. And there's different lot and yard provisions based on the type. So it's not the same lot provision, it's not the same yard, because every institutional use is going to have different requirements. Then we have 3 commercial zones. And then of course, don't forget, this is not the only location you have commercial. All the mixed use has commercial, but these are the smaller ones that are not the mixed use zones. So we have one for automobile service, which is basically gas bars, car washes. Those are separately zoned. They also permit a convenience store. Have you ever been to, we always go to the gas stations now, and they have a convenience store when you go to pay for your gas. They also, the convenience commercial zone, these are the really small, little commercial sites in the interior of a neighborhood, maybe a little convenience store. And then we have the neighborhood commercial zone, which is a little bit bigger. It's the small plazas where you have multiple retail stores, but they're fairly small. We still find those in the neighborhoods. Employment zones, we have 2 employment zones, general employment zone and prestige employment zone. The prestige employment zone you generally find along Highway 403. Permits more prestige, higher requirements for landscaping. And the general employment has more limited, so prestige doesn't have the heavier industrial, also permits some of the convenience store personal services on certain locations. Then the other zones, which I'm not going to go through in any detail, we have an agricultural zone, which basically encompasses all the agricultural lands that were in Brant County that got brought into the city. And we have one zone for that to permit the agricultural uses. Core natural zone is the natural features, and they're designated in the official plan. So very limited uses permitted in that zone, but protects them for the natural features. Open space zone is your parks and open space, cemeteries. And we have a development zone. And what the development zone is that in the newer greenfield area, because we don't know until the developers submit draft plans of subdivision, identify where the schools go, where the parks go, where the mid-rise will go. We don't know that in detail that we can put it in a zoning bylaw. So we've zoned them as development zone, which basically permits the existing uses until they come forward with their applications. Then lastly is a holding zone. The Planning Act allows municipality to put a hold on until something's done. Usually it's because we're waiting for servicing to happen, some other provisions. So the existing zoning bylaw has a number of different holding provisions, and those are all summarized in the table in chapter 15. So that's a long, but that covers off the zoning bylaw. So now we just want, Josh has done a great job of pulling together what we've heard so far and Let's Talk Brantford and other submissions he's got. So we just wanted to cover off a few of the things that he's heard just before we close the presentation. So I mentioned this earlier, but some people are asking, what does the PP mean along the intensification corridors? Well, if you recall, it's the pedestrian prominent requirement. So it reflects where we've got existing retail and commercial uses and trying to maintain that. Especially on Colburn Street, we've got existing retail commercial areas. We want to maintain those commercial areas. So that means that you can have redevelopment. You can redevelop that commercial property, but if you do and you want residential on it, put the residential above the main floor and commercial on the main floor or the ground floor. Going through this again, we also had a number of questions. What do the letters FAC mean, followed by following the existing neighborhood low-rise zone? So I went over that before with you. F is the minimum lot frontage, A is the minimum lot area, and C is the minimum lot coverage. And then the next question we've got a couple of is, how will the current site-specific zones be applied in the new zoning bylaw? This is a good question because in a zoning bylaw, some applicants come forward and say, I want this on my property, and I seek an application, it gets approved, but it's slightly different from what the zoning bylaw allows for. And so the city will pass a site-specific provision. So it may say, well, here's a residential area. We want to give it a slightly less side yard, or we want to have a slightly less lot area. So you'll have a site-specific provision. And there's many of them in the existing zoning bylaw. We're working through those right now and going through all the existing site-specific provisions. And those that have already been addressed because of the changes in the zoning bylaw, maybe it limited to permitted use and now that use is permitted. Maybe it changed the side yard, now that side yard is permitted. So we're going through all those to see those that are no longer needed. Those are still needed. We were just looking at trying to simplify those, but those will come in the next version of the bylaw. We want to get this version out first, then go through those site specific. So if anybody's got a site specific provision, we're not taking away any permitted uses. We're not taking away anything that's been approved already. We'll be maintaining that unless it's already permitted now in the new bylaw. And you'll see those in the next version of the schedules. Well, the schedule, if a property has a site-specific provision, it'll identify that number for that site-specific provision on the property. And then what is the purpose of the new development zone? How does that fit with the zoning amendment process? So I think I explained that a little bit. This applies to the new urban areas and the expansion areas. So north of Power Line Road, for instance, in that area. So what you see here, the permitted uses, basically it's the existing agriculture uses and existing residential uses or other uses are permitted right now. No new uses, because what we want is the landowners to go through the process to bring on whatever could be designated for a residential. We want them to go through that process, identify where the schools, the parks, the medium density, the mid-rise goes, the low-rise goes, and we'll then zone it appropriately when they come forward with their applications. So I think that covers off a couple of the main questions we've gotten so far. We'll probably get a lot more tonight, which would be great. And just the next steps where we're going next. We have undertaking a series of stakeholder meetings. Staff are undertaking a number of those over the next couple of weeks. We're reviewing and finalizing the site-specific exceptions, as I indicated. And then we're going to prepare a second draft based on all the comments we received, incorporate all the site-specific provisions, and then we'll be having a statutory public meeting likely in June. And then it'll be up for council adoption after that. So that's through the presentation. I'll end that now. Donna is going to facilitate our discussion. So if you have any questions, either for those in person or those online, leave it over to you, Donna.
Thank you. So now is your chance to ask any questions before we break for the part of the meeting, or as was introduced in the beginning, open house formats are welcome to go back and hover around the maps, and all of the staff team will be back at that end of the room to answer any site specific or particular questions, but anything general. Yep, I'll go here and then in the back. And oh yes, so if you wouldn't mind coming up to the front and speaking in the mic, I'm going to take one question from the floor. Before I go to the second, I'll go to the online meeting and see if we have another question.
Just so the people online can hear.
Yeah.
So my questions, oh, we're working now. Okay, good. My questions are basically related to accessory dwelling units.
Mhm.
So small time developer, I'm basically just, trying to put some ADUs on a few properties that I own. So it's a general question, not site specific.
Mhm.
The first one being is, I believe on the policy that you guys are only allowing three units total. I know you said the zoning bylaw right now is 30 years old. But the other municipalities such as Burlington, they just recently passed or approved that they're going to be doing 4 on property. So just so that we don't get stuck in another 30 years, potentially that could be considered if it could fit on the property, obviously meeting parking requirements, etc. That's
Sorry, let me just answer one at a time. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
that's good for that.
Great. So right now, the zoning bylaw permits 1 per property, but the province changed the Planning Act and changed the requirement. So any bylaw currently that is in existence that doesn't permit 3 on a property is no longer in place. So we automatically, based on the changes to the Planning Act, have to permit 3, which could be 3 in a dwelling. And this is a single, semi, or townhouse, or it could be 2 in the dwelling and 1 in an accessory building. So that's what the bylaw now is providing, and it's meeting the requirement of the Planning Act. There are other municipalities, a few other municipalities that have gone with 4, but that is not where we're going at this current time. But provide us with a comment on that, and we'll take that back to staff and to council.
Okay, then another kind of issue that I've been running into as well, it's kind of a multi-issue, is the setbacks. So right now with the setbacks for an ADU, if you do a detached, you can go up to 0.6 meters from the property line, which is beneficial, obviously. But if you put a building addition on, you got to stay within like the 7.5 meter setbacks. So that's just very restrictive. If you could put on a building addition, it's much more feasible from a cost perspective. And also the banks right now, or the funding institutions, if you have on a residential lot a detached ADU, they don't see that as an actual like additional unit. So they basically won't fund it unless you already have the funds available. So that's been one hurdle trying to get through. So the detached really is making an issue.
So maybe explain that when you say 7.5, are you meeting the minimum rear yard requirement?
Yes.
I see.
Yeah, so if it'd be much simpler, much more feasible, easier to connect into the existing services, the water line, the electrical, potentially the sanitary, there's some code issues with that, mind you, to not go through units.
Yeah.
But if it could just be, basically attach and go up to that 0.6 meters would be very beneficial.
Well, that would be, probably we wouldn't go there, and I'll tell you why, is because if you're putting in an additional dwelling unit in an accessory building, the accessory building is supposed to be lower. So it's a lower height. Right now, it's only permitted on the ground floor of an accessory building. If you put that into the building and say, well, I want the building to go back to 0.6 from the lot line, you can go up to the 10 meters. So now you have a much bigger building going fully into the rear yard, which will impact more of the neighbors. We recognize we need to accommodate more of the accessory buildings. But we also need to make sure it doesn't impact on the neighborhood. So it's a bit of a balance you got to remember in a neighborhood, because you want to increase and provide for more residents in the neighborhood, but you also have to make sure it's not impacting on the neighbors.
Could you potentially, as a solution to that though, like past the, whatever the rear setback is, so let's say 7.5 meters, past that has to be single story?
It's something we could look at for sure.
Because that.
We could look at,
that
we
would
could
make
look at
sense.
different provisions
Yeah,
for that.
because if they're trying to accommodate all this housing and trying to get your smaller people or just homeowners to do this, if you can't get the funding for it, because the banks don't look at it as an additional, they put it as a garage. So maybe add $50,000 to your property.
Understood. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I guess the other one would be like 10% lot coverage as well. Like they are able to make pretty small units these days. So 10% lot coverage, I would think that as long as you can accommodate the parking, because obviously that's a big one. You don't want cars on the street. If that could be larger, I would say the maximum size that you guys had, which is about 645 square feet, that seems perfectly reasonable. I would say for like a proper single bedroom apartment, because if you limit it to 10%, like a standard lot downtown is like 30 by 60, 30 by 90, you're going to fit, 300 square feet, which you could technically fit by code, but that's not really comfortable for the residents,
I see. Okay.
I would say. And then sorry, and the last one you kind of already ex-named, which is the 2 stories.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the online. Are there any questions, the online?
Yes, thanks, Donna. We have, for those attending virtually, if you can use your raise hand button so that we can go in order of questions. We'll be altering back and forth, like Donna said, between in-person questions and virtual questions. We do have quite a few virtual attendees. We have 18 right now. So please don't worry, we will get to everybody online. And I'm going to start with a few of our live questions that we have on our Q&A here. We'll start with Mr. Dave Medeiros, and his question is, what do we hope to achieve from this meeting? And how often do we have this meeting for bylaw?
I'm gonna have Josh from the city answer that.
So thanks, Dave, and thanks, Darlene, for that question online. So I think really Paul touched on it at different points during the presentation, but we're really hoping to collect feedback through this process and, the various phases of the zoning bylaw project. A lot of background information has been collected, reviewing best practice, and then bringing forward a new zoning bylaw. It's a big undertaking, as indicated, a new document. I think one of the things that we want to take away is all the feedback. Although staff are in the weeds and looking at everything in detail with the project team, there are obviously some things that, are property specific that we want to hear from the various constituents on and hear from council on. So it's an opportunity for that. And that's really the takeaway of this meeting. And obviously we have a 2-month period here. The document's been released December 4th to the end of this month. And we want to get as much information as we can from the public and all stakeholders to bring forward a new document, a new document that's, concise, robust, but easy to read and easy to use. So that's really the takeaway. In terms of how often this happens, obviously there's been a number of PICs. This is the 3rd PIC for this project. So starting with the background work, the discussion papers through to the strategic directions report, which really functions as our blueprint for this document. There's been multiple opportunities, but obviously we're looking for opportunities to engage and opportunities to connect with the public as this process rolls out. So thanks for that question.
Okay, back to the room. I think there was a question. Yep, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the desk, turning the mic on. Thank you.
Now it's all you. Well, first of all, a comment. I'm a retired lawyer and I have to compliment you on this is much easier to read than 16090. That's about as far as I'm going to go.
Thank you.
I live at Gulfdale Road, which is presently zoned R1A-2. That's the R1A minimum requirements, but a frontage of 24.5 meters and an area of 745. So on the NLR zone that you're doing, you've got us back to 18 meters. and 550 square meter area. You mentioned that you tried to make those numbers fit the characteristics of the neighborhood, and with respect, it does not. The Ava Road area extending west of Ava Road from Hardy Road down to Westmount, and all those neighborhoods are all zoned R1A2. They've been there, probably built up almost more than 60 years. There's been the odd infill that complied with the R1A2 zone. But this does not fit the characteristics as far as
So
we're
you don't-
concerned. And we had this same, I'm aging myself, we had this same battle when 160-90 was a draft bylaw. It was going to be an 18-meter, 500 square meter property, and the 2 exception was then made. So that's what we're asking for.
Okay, let's hear, let me get the city staff to respond.
Sure. So thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate it. And thanks for providing feedback. You had highlighted the site specifics for this area. And I think when we're looking at the NLR zone and looking at some of those existing neighborhoods, Paul touched on it, right? We want to respect the character of the various neighborhoods and communities within this city. And so that's certainly something that we're going to be going back and looking at. But I also think that Paul touched on it. We haven't looked at site specifics. So if that opportunity through us looking at site specifics and that specific zoning that is for Ava Road and Golfdale, that's something that we want to look at and make sure we're respecting the character of that community. So I appreciate the feedback, and this is exactly the conversation that we want.
So I had sent something into Let's Talk Brantford. So how do I continue on with the feedback, or have you got it?
So I received the feedback from Let's Talk Brantford. I think there was actually a few residents within this area that provided feedback, and I provided some rationale on the site specifics. I don't know if that went directly to you, and if it didn't, I apologize. But yeah, absolutely, through the next draft and through our site specifics, we'll be continuing that. And if there are certain elements that you want to have a conversation on, then by all means, make sure you have my contact
It's
information.
interesting to note that on November 3rd, a unanimous decision of the Committee of Adjustment for the city refused an application for 3 severances for 3 18-meter lots in the zone, and city planning had to say, recommend refusal, and the neighbors, of course, objected, and it was turned down. And then 3 weeks later, this is published,
Yeah.
and it would have gone through without a hitch. So that's what we're worried about, is keeping the characteristic of the neighborhood.
Certainly, and I appreciate your comments here this evening. And like I said, through the site-specific process, we'll be going back and looking at this area, certainly.
Second question, I don't know whether or not it's part of provincial policy or not, but there's not a single semi-detached dwelling in that whole neighborhood stretching from Westmount to Hardy Road. And there's a lot of presently prohibited uses that are now allowed: group homes, group correctional homes, short-term rentals, semi-detached. And I was wondering why all of those uses are being thrown in a already developed area, that none of those exist.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're, a number of them are, we're making sure we're requiring those through the provincial policy. We have to make sure we provide for housing for those that need it, all aspects. So you'll find some of that. The singles and semis, we're making that applied across the low-rise neighborhood because that is allowed for in the official plan. But we'll make sure that we have the lot sizes and the frontage appropriate for that area.
Lot sizes and frontage would solve some of those prohibited uses from coming forward.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome. And we heard you. So thank you.
Okay, let's go back online. Next question.
Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. They're asking, can lot coverage percentage be subsidized with the installation of rain barrels and or permeable products for walkways?
I think I understand the question is that they're asking, I think when they say subsidize, I'm thinking they're meaning reduced. And no, I mean, those are great aspects for sustainability, for rain barrels and allowing infiltration, but that doesn't change the other requirements we have setbacks for is to maintain a certain characteristic in the neighborhood, to maintain some sense of separation. That the rain barrels and et cetera address overall infiltration, but it doesn't address the other characteristics why we require those provisions. So no, those won't definitely encourage them, but no, that wouldn't change the zoning provisions.
Okay, other questions from the floor? Okay, so in the black sweater. You just have to.
Good evening,
turn
everybody.
that-
My
oh,
name's
that's
Chris
on.
and I live on Mount Pleasant Road
Mhm.
between Tootle Heights Road and Conklin on the west side of Mount Pleasant Road. We're getting everything, intensification, we're getting we're suburban residential, but we're not. And in the near future, we'll have probably not just rise, but high rise in that area. And so for our property on the west side of the street, these are estate-sized properties. And the developer is proposing just in our block from the south corridor of Pleasant Ridge to Conklin, over 50 homes, abutting against 10 homes. And I'm wondering if there might be some kind of accommodations for that to reduce the number of homes in our backyards. That might be with setbacks, it might be with a green space. There's no green space planned. It could be a trail. It just seems like the urban design plan is not speaking to the official plan.
Okay.
The urban design plan says that we'll respect the existing homeowners and the compatibility of new builds with old residential areas. I just don't think that that's happening.
Okay, let me see which one, Joshua.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Thank you for coming in tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you on the zoning bylaw and the block planning process as well. I think some of the processes that we're talking about was referenced here tonight. The area that is adjacent to you is proposed in this zoning bylaw as development, which is an interim zone. So it actually doesn't identify certain zones like neighborhood low rise or greenfield neighborhood low rise for the discussion that we're having. I think that one of the important pieces that you're talking about and what that future area looks like and that buffer between suburban residential and the adjacent neighborhoods, it's really going to be important that those discussions happen as part of a formal planning application, which would be through plan of subdivision and a zoning bylaw process.
Mm.
And those processes haven't transpired. There haven't been any subsequent applications for our team and the public to review as a whole. But that's where that opportunity and all the things that you've identified are going to be very important, right? That those things come forward and those are discussed both with council and staff as well.
I'd like to recommend like a neighborhood meeting too, with both sides of Mount Pleasant Road.
Okay.
For the Tootle Heights and Mount Pleasant area.
Okay.
A lot of our neighbors have no idea this is going on.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that feedback. And I think that outside of the zoning bylaw, I think that there's also an opportunity for us to share information on block planning. And there's some additional things that we can do to share those resources and share that information and process with members of the public. So I do appreciate your feedback, Chris.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, back online.
Okay, our next question is how long will it take before these new bylaws become active?
Thank you. A great question. So once council approves it, if there are no appeals, it becomes in effect immediately. If there are appeals, then it will be addressed after the Ontario Land Tribunal addresses the appeal, which most likely would be site-specific appeals once they're scoped. So once the OLT deals with it, and if they're just site-specific appeals, it comes into effect the day council approves it. But if there are site-specific appeals, it will be delayed for those properties that are under appeal. So generally, it should come into effect for most properties the day that council approves it.
Okay, there was a question in the back. Yep, come on up.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask some questions. Just as a follow-up to what was just addressed on time period. Yes, it's understood that when council approves it, that's when it becomes law, I guess. But the question from my side is, when is that? I heard June, sometimes, this year. Is that realistic?
Yeah, quite realistic. We're aiming for a June public meeting. Then once the council holds the public meeting, they'll refer those questions back to staff and the consulting team to address. And then we'll come forward with the final document. So hopefully in July, if that's possible, September at the latest. But I would think we'd probably be back in July for final approval.
Okay, great. Just as an additional questioning that I have, excuse me. I guess it's a self-interest type of a question. On a current C3 zone, mixed commercial residential, there's a variety of uses that are available under the current zoning bylaw. And of interest to me is obviously the residential aspects of the permissions, such as duplex dwellings, fourplex, semi-detached apartments, and so on. I noticed in the proposed new bylaw that zone becomes now a commercial zone, and in particular, a neighborhood commercial zone. There, I noticed that the only residential permission is an apartment dwelling unit, and is also qualified, making sure that there is a commercial space at the main floor and then apartments or dwellings above. Now, I guess the question that I have here is on behalf of a landowner developing currently, trying to put a residential unit onto the property and having an opportunity to perhaps put another building on the same property. If he or she goes beyond the adoption date of the new bylaw, does that mean that that person will be prevented from putting in residential dwelling units other than apartments?
Okay, yeah, sure. So thanks for coming in. Thanks for providing some questions. So I hope to also engage with you afterwards and chat a little bit about the property.
That'd be perfect.
And talk about it in a little bit more detail. But I think when we're looking at the C3 zone and how that transfers over into the new zoning bylaw, I think we're trying to also keep in mind what these areas are going to transition to in the future. So identifying what some of those land uses are in our official plan, kind of as our guiding document, some of the work that we did as part of the strategic directions report, and then implementing really that as our basis. So kind of talking about opportunities for intensified built form and what that commercial zone is going to look like in the future. I think that's really where that formation came from. But like I said, I hope to get the chance to chat with you about this property a little bit more in detail so we can understand how it's transitioned over time as well. In terms of some of the other comments, I'll direct those to Paul.
Certainly. And I would say that the C3 zone is probably one more difficult to fit into the current category. So as Josh said, I think a great would have a discussion with you and just figure out what you want and what's on the property and how we fit that into the new zoning bylaw. But in terms of your question on what happens after this zoning bylaw comes in place, if you had a certain use that exists on the property and new zoning bylaw comes in place and doesn't allow for that use, that use is now called legal non-conforming. In other words, that use can stay and be legal because it was previously legal. If the property was vacant and had certain zoning on that allowed a few things, but that changed, then that legal non-conforming no longer would apply because there was nothing that was there. So it really is in terms of what's the existing use and was that permitted before, and then it allowed to be permitted in the future. So your case, it sounds like something you want to do. So let's talk about how we fit that how we transition that C3 zone to the new zoning bylaw.
Yeah, because, excuse me, on behalf of a client, my concern would be the timing in terms of, redevelopment of the property. Because I notice in the C3 zone, like a lot of the current properties are in fact residential. So once we convert the to the new bylaw, and it'll be neighborhood commercial, Does that mean that all of these properties now, if I want to redevelop them or to reuse them, they're all going to be apartment buildings with commercial spaces at the main floor? And I'm just not convinced that that was the intent. However, I'll leave that and I'll gladly meet you at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Online?
We have a question from Mr. James Warren. James, if you can go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So just at our last meeting, it was discussed that the amenity space requirement could be a general amount. So say it was, for this sake, 9 meters squared per unit. And it can be provided in a format that is determined by the applicant. So if it's 9 meters squared, it could be 9 meters squared of area in a private yard or a common space or via balcony. Is it still that intention with the new bylaw, or is it going to be more prescriptive on how that 9 meters required is going to be provided?
Certainly, good question. I don't remember that specific discussion because we hadn't got there yet, but what we're requiring for apartment buildings, for an apartment building itself is 5 square meters per unit. And that for that amount, 50% must be provided outdoor, and 25% must be included indoor. So that gives you 25% to go either way, flexibility to provide that other 25% outdoor or that other 25% indoor. But it's providing for some indoor, some outdoor. So 5 square meters per unit, 50% outdoor, 25% indoor.
Thank you. I guess just one further thought then. I didn't notice a specific provision for how it would apply to townhouses or back-to-back or stacked townhouses.
Yeah, there is a square meter provision for those townhouses that aren't standard street townhouses that would have a backyard. There is a requirement for that in the bylaw. I just have to try and find it, which is a specific square meters per dwelling. Sorry, it would take me a minute to find it. Yeah, so for street townhouse with a detached rear garage, it's 25 square meters. With an integral garage, it's 15. Back-to-back townhouses are 8, and so on. I would encourage you to look at table 33 of the bylaw, which is just one area, it's neighborhood corridor zone, but we've got consistent provisions for all those different types of townhouses. So take a look at the bylaw, table 33. There's a few other tables that has it for the different housing forms, and you'll see those provisions by type.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, James. Any other questions from the floor? Yep, in the back. Come on up.
I have just 2 kind of general questions and just want to congratulate staff on all the hard work that's gone into the zoning bylaw and a really thorough presentation that answered most of my questions. So that's great. My first question is about the flood protection overlay zone, and it's kind of a 2-parter. So one being where that mapping kind of came from, if that's Conservation Authority mapping, something like that, or flowing down from the official plan. And then the second part is if there's been any consideration to allowing for kind of revisions to the boundaries of that overlay subject to, you know, technical study approved by the city and Conservation Authority, kind of similar to what's happening with the core natural zone, where you can do that without amendment to the plan.
Yeah, so I'll answer the, sorry. So first of all, thank you for coming in and thanks for the comments. Appreciate it. The first question is in regards to, you know, this change, I guess under the current zoning, we have an F prefix. And so now with this overlay, yes, it does align with the boundaries that have been established to the GRCA.
Okay.
Some of the questions around modifying that, that would be something I would need to look at in a little bit more detail.
Okay.
I would assume that, you know, any modifications to that would be done closely with the GRCA,
Yeah,
and
right.
we would be really relying on the mapping that they provide through their studies.
I see. Okay. So
So
maybe an approved permit, something like that.
yeah, well,
Like-
and it is a permitting process outlined in our zoning bylaw, so I
Mhm.
think that that would really be the avenue, but
Okay.
yeah, I would be hesitant to say yes, you know, similar
course.
to our official plan where we have a 90-meter buffer where, you know, we
Yeah.
can do a detailed study to understand, you know, what the modifications of a certain boundary would be. I might
Okay.
be hesitant to say that with the flood protection zone, but
Okay, fair enough.
thank you for
That's
the
just-
question, though.
Yeah, yeah, just food for thought. And then my other question is just on the section regarding the waste and recyclable room. I noticed that the zoning provisions kind of, or sorry, areas, not room. The zoning provisions kind of come almost verbatim from the site plan control manual. So just wondering if it's, like I can appreciate that establishing sort of what your zoning room or your waste room might look like in like a mid-rise or a high-rise through zoning, but sometimes that's a little premature based on the plans that you have done at the time. So just wondering if there's any thought given to making those sections a little bit more permissible, so we don't have to do things like, you know, figuring out where the bollards are gonna be for the waste trucks and things like that at the stage of zoning, just build in that added flexibility there.
Yeah, no, so I think that that's great feedback. I think that through this new zoning bylaw, that's feedback that we would definitely be looking at. And then a
Okay.
comment like that, an opportunity to look at something through site plan, right, would definitely be an added bonus. So definitely some feedback we can take.
Okay, great.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to the online.
Okay, we have a few more live questions in our Q&A. Will there be any housekeeping amendment for recently amended County of Brant zoning? For example, if a residential zone is rezoned in 2024.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think that, you know, we'd have to look at that in a little bit more detail, but the zoning bylaw that applies to the expansion lands, the county zoning wouldn't apply to that. The city has taken on that portion of the zoning bylaw, so the zoning that would apply would be, it's kind of time stamped. We have a certain zoning bylaw that we have taken from the county of Brant. So it would be the zoning bylaw that's online. There's a zoning bylaw amendment that's happened in the county that applies to county lands and not the city of Brantford.
We have another question from Shane Hamlin. His question is why 13 Beach Road falling into open space and natural core? The property has an existing dilapidated house on it and is one of the original homes and does not have an R1B like others on the street and the neighborhood.
I can answer that. So Shane, thank you for the comment. Appreciate it. This is definitely an area that we're looking at in a little bit more detail. I think when we go back and look at this comment that's been provided, we also received this comment as well. So obviously our first thing is to look at the official plan. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to look at this area in a bit more detail. 13 Beach Road has a residential designation in the city's official plan, not as in its entirety. There's obviously a portion of the property that has core natural features that need to be respected, which have been carried through in the zoning, but certainly that portion of the property which has an official plan designation applied, we would be looking, you know, to align that with, we would be looking to align the city's official plan and zoning together. So appreciate that feedback and something that we'll definitely take forward into the next draft.
Can we do another call out for any other questions from the floor? Okay, so then I think we're just on the online ones and then we'll break for the open house part of the meeting.
Yes, I have another question from an anonymous attendee. I did not read the strategic direction document, but asks, were density targets part of the vision for the new zoning bylaw? If so, what is the target for Brantford in terms of persons/square kilometers?
This is in the official plan, not in the zoning bylaw, but in the official plan, we have a target for the designated greenfield area, which is the new greenfield areas that came out of the official plan, and that density is how many persons in jobs per hectare? Is it 50? 60. Is it 60? 60 persons in jobs per hectare? Sorry, it was 2 years ago, we wrote that official plan and now it's escaping me. But that's set out in the official plan, and then we create the zoning to make sure we achieve that. So in terms of the densities we have on units per hectare, but the overall persons and jobs is set out in the official plan.
Okay, we have one more. This anonymous attendee is asking, given multiple cities are moving towards reduced parking ratios, such as Hamilton and Toronto, et cetera, especially along transit routes, and the results of the parking study described in Appendix A of the ZBL project strategic direction documents, is there any option in the second draft to separate parking requirements for rental apartments versus condos versus townhouses? Since the study does show the parking utilization rate for rental apartments is much lower than what's currently suggested in the draft. This is mostly in the intensification redevelopment zones.
So that study was done. I was the person who's reviewing it, and thanks for that comment. For those that aren't aware, that study was done as part of the strategic directions report, and there was an appendix to it, and that's what the person is referring to as the appendix. That staff did a very extensive analysis and survey of all the existing apartment buildings in the city, and looking at what the parking rates were, and came up with an alternative parking requirement, which is in the bylaw now. So there's a separate requirement for townhouses and for apartments, and apartments in different parts of the city, so the downtown versus other parts. We don't have it for rental, so that's a good question. We can go back and look at whether it should be a different provision for rental versus ownership. And it's a good comment. We'll take a look at. Thank you.
Okay, and that concludes our online questions at the moment.
And one final call out. Any other questions from the floor? And not seeing any, so I think we're good to bring the meeting to a close and go into the open house portion of the session, gathering at the maps in the back of the room. Josh?
Donna,
Could we,
sorry,
could we see if any counselors have any questions?
I was just going to ask that. And also one panelist does have a question. That was Councillor Hunt. So I'll leave it with councillors to see if they have any questions or comments. Yeah, go ahead.
I do. Is this the time to do it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you create a map that will show the entire city and highlight the areas where there's changes? If it's been left alone, just leave it as it is, but where you're proposing changes, highlight those areas so that people know. I think most people, besides developers and builders, what they want to know is what could happen next door to me, or what could I do to my house? And if there's no changes permitted in the area where they live, then they know. But if there are changes that are permitted, then I think that should be highlighted so that they're aware of that if something comes up next door and the fellow wants to sever a lot off and do something, he knows that that's a potential thing that could happen to him in his neighborhood.
So thank you for the question. I think that there's a lot of questions on mapping and how we can visually share change with the community and inform people. And so we're going to continue to explore that. Being that there are a number of zones in the current zoning bylaw, and they've been condensed through the new zoning bylaw and some of that mapping. We do have some internal mapping online. So maybe there's an opportunity to do just that and show the comparison. This is what it was zoned before, and this is what it is zoned now. I'll have to give some thought to it, but I think it's a good comment. I think that there's also some thought as this project moves forward towards June to allow residents to understand changes, whether it's an intensification corridor that they're now just outside in terms of zoning, and try and share that information with them, specifically for if it is the IC zone, the intensification corridor, or a commercial node that they're now adjacent to. So certainly I like that idea, and we'll take that back.
I think we just put a lot of minds at ease if they understand what can or can't happen next door,
right,
or on their property. The second question I have is, in cases we compel a high-rise building to put commercial on the ground floor, and it remains empty, it's dirty, that's not looked after because it's vacant, and it goes on in perpetuity, but we forced them to build it. Have we looked at that and why we do that? And is there another way of filling that ground floor?
Good question, Councillor. The broad range of uses are permitted, so not just retail, but service, for entertainment, um,
It's all the empty ones
assembly.
I'm concerned with,
Pardon me?
not what, it's the empty ones I'm
Yeah,
concerned with, not
well-
what could go in it, but that there's
No, no,
nothing
no,
in it.
no. What I'm saying is what we're trying to do is provide for a range of uses that could go in those. What we don't want to do, we're trying to plan for the future. And what you don't want to do is to take an existing vibrant retail area and allow something that happens in the center of it that is no longer commercial, and it reflects on destroying that commercial strip. So we're being very careful of trying to identify those pedestrian promenade areas, which are the vibrant retail areas, the ones you want to maintain. The rest of the areas, we don't care. So all the rest of the intensification corridor, yeah, sure, it could be residential at the ground floor, but it's those core commercial areas you want to maintain as commercial. And hopefully they're vibrant enough that that space won't remain empty. But what we don't want is, we don't want the entire of the intensification corridors all being like that, and then we have vacant ground floors. That's not what we want. So I think the key is to make sure we identify the proper locations for that pedestrian promenade area, and make sure those are the areas we really want a ground floor commercial, and those are ones we want in the future to be that. And make sure that also to provide for a range of uses in case, you know, restaurants may work today, but maybe this other use will work today. So it's a bit of a balance that we need to be careful of.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hunt has a question.
First of all, I just wanted to thank our staff and the consultants. The presentation was very thorough, as well as just the work on the project itself. I guess my question probably is for Joshua. You've mentioned stakeholder meetings to be held in the next couple of weeks. Can you just clearly define a little bit more as to who we're referring to in terms of stakeholders?
Evening, Councillor. Thank you for the question. So in terms of our stakeholder engagement, there's a variety of groups that we're aiming to meet with. Six Nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation, the Chamber of Commerce, the Brantford Homebuilders Association. We're still in the process of kind of arranging some meetings, just because coming out of the new year, scheduling meetings has been a bit difficult, but neighborhood associations, we met with the task force today, obviously, but obviously a number of different groups, very similar to our official plan process, where we get a chance to engage with these different groups. So.
Okay, thanks for that. And I too kind of want to echo what Councillor Sluss indicated in terms of specifically the intensification corridors. I know Councillor Carpenter will certainly agree that we're seeing developments along Colburn Street that are backing onto some very well-established residential neighborhoods, and these people are, you know, they're getting like a notice that there's a development happening in the intensification corridor, but they really have no idea what that means, that they are actually adjacent to a property that's on an intensification corridor. So I think it would be helpful potentially for like a little bit of that overlay. So it just says if you live on Avondale Crescent and your backyard backs onto a property that's currently on Colburn Street, yes, there could be quite frankly an apartment building built in your backyard, because this is the feedback that we're getting now, that constituents are not aware that could, you know, happen right there in their established neighborhood.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment, and certainly agree. As you mentioned, Councillor Carpenter, there was some discussion about, you know, the opportunity to share that information and let people know about the changes in zoning. So if we're focusing on certain areas, whether that's intensification corridor or another zone, we'll definitely continue to look at opportunities to share that information to inform members of the public. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I just want to echo, I know one of the participants in the room mentioned potentially a neighborhood meeting in areas where there is an intensification corridor that could potentially, I mean, and we're not looking at something that might be happening in the next, 6 months, but just the fact that awareness and education is the key there, that you are living potentially in an area where there's an intensification corridor directly behind you. So neighborhood meetings would be helpful. And then just finally to wrap up, thank you to everyone that did attend online, and those of you who are there in person. I've taken lots of notes myself, and appreciate the engagement. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from council or Mayor Davis? Would you like to say anything? Okay.
I had my hand up.
I'm sorry, you had, I saw it and then it disappeared. I'm sorry, Councillor.
I thought you took it down. I didn't take it down.
No, go ahead with your question, please.
Following up on what Councillor Hunt said, and Councillor Celeste for that matter, you mentioned about the intensification corridors, and that maybe not all buildings should have retail on the bottom, or that there maybe you could look into that. But what I find with the intensification corridors, a lot of them, like when we talk about Colburn Street, back in the day, the intent was to get some activity happening in dead areas, things where there was zero activity. Canadian Tire parking lot, to be specific. So intensifying an area that was completely open space and affected nobody made sense. And we had a number of those spots along Colburn Street like that. But what we've done is we've taken a red marker and went up and down everywhere where we've set intensification corridors, and we've created, you can call it a one size fits all or a one size fits none, but it does not fit the nuances that we have from block to block even. And so when we do this, we have no way to address constituents' needs when we say, yeah, we're happy with it over there, but right here in this spot isn't a fit. So I would like to have some flexibility when we say intensification corridor, because otherwise you're just basically saying, we can put a 20-story or a 12-story building up and down it. So that's my one point. The other question I have is Erie Ave was mentioned 6 stories high, and other areas were less than that for the maximum. Why is that? Thanks for that question, Councillor. Heritage Conservation District on Brant Street, that Heritage Conservation District plan permits only up to 3 stories. So the zoning bylaw has to conform to that Heritage Conservation District plan. So that's why it's limited to 3 stories. The official plan also sets out for Erie Street that only to be 6 stories. So those are 2 other plans that set out the requirements that the zoning bylaw has to have regard for and be consistent with. So that's why those differences. The rest of the corridors are up to 12 stories, but as I went through some of the provisions that apply to the intensification corridors and other mixed use areas, we've got to remember the angular plane requirement. So that you may not be able to meet that tallest provisions because you're too close to low density residential, and it will have to be a lower height because of those provisions. So there's a number of different aspects they're there to try and mitigate that additional height.
Okay, so then I'm with Councillor Hunt that I'd like to see public meetings that can contact the residents nearby to express the effects of an intensification corridor and those heights, because honestly, 6 stories does fit in a certain spot, but maybe not in another spot on the same street. So I do believe that the density, the general residential density around that would be appropriate. So is that a possibility then that we can inform the public greater?
Councilor Tilburg, thank you for the comment, and certainly something we can look into in terms of reaching out through mail or looking at specific zones with councillors to create opportunities for education.
Thank you.
Okay, so we welcome everyone to come back to the back of the room if you want to speak to any of the maps. Thank you very much. And we're bringing the online meeting to a close as well. And thank you very much to the online participants. We will end the meeting on everyone's behalf.